They thought I wouldn't show up. They thought shame could hold me back. I stared at the invitation for nearly an hour. It sat on the cold wooden table, as if unaware of what it carried. A white envelope, embossed edges, my name printed in full, John Mercer. 6 years, not a single call, not a postcard, not a word of concern since the day I was pushed out of my wife's funeral. The wax seal on the back was still unbroken, but I already knew what was inside. I'd heard whispers from old acquaintances, from stray lines and forgotten emails. Daniel, my son, was getting married. Not just married, but married with all the fanfare, and I was only informed with a gentle jab to the ribs, a late invitation, accompanied by a small note in Elaine's handwriting. My ex-wife, who no longer spoke my name, behave properly. I held it in my hands that had gripped a rifle for decades, yet now trembled. 6 years ago, at the funeral, I stood through the entire service when they didn't save me a seat in the front row. Elaine sat in the middle, Daniel beside her, not looking at me, not saying my name, as if I'd never been his father. I remember the sound of the honor guard's rifles, the bugle echoing in the open air, while I could only swallow the silence and the cold stares of the entire family. Since that day, no one reached out, no one mentioned me. 6 years of silence, and now this invitation appeared, as if I were just a shadow to be managed, not a man who had given his entire life. I set the invitation down and walked to the window. Outside, the wind whistled through the old flagpole, creaking, a familiar sound from the years I stood guard at distant bases. In the room, my uniform was still neatly folded, my wife's photos still on the shelf. I sighed, knowing my choice. If I didn't go, they'd rewrite history, tell my life story in a way that erased my existence. If I went, at least I'd be there in flesh and blood, undeniable. I picked up the phone, searched for flights, not to be welcomed, but to prove that John Mercer was still here, and no one could make me disappear. I set the phone down, turned to the dresser. The hinges squeaked softly as the door opened, revealing the uniform that had lain still for years. The dim light from the desk lamp fell on it, metals glinting in the dark like memories that never slept. I touched the shoulder, the feeling both familiar and strange, the thick fabric that had accompanied me through sun-scorched lands, through dust and gunpowder, now carrying a different weight, the weight of forgotten memories. I lifted the uniform out, laid it on the bed, and in that moment, my wife's funeral came back like a knife slicing through memory. That day, I wore this uniform, pristine, thinking at least there'd be a place for me in the front row. But Elaine stood in my way, her voice icy. You don't need to embarrass the family further. Daniel, the son I raised, glanced at me, then turned away, as if the man in the uniform was no longer his father. I stood through the service, at the back, listening to the rifles, the national anthem, my heart turning to stone. No one called my name. No one's eyes sought me out. After that day, 6 years passed in silence, and now this uniform was the only witness to the years the family wanted to forget. I sat down, smoothed the creases, the metal of the metals cold against my fingertips. Just then, a knock at the door. Mark Harlan, my old comrade, now gray-haired, stepped in, his eyes landing on the uniform. You gonna wear it? He asked, voice slow. I stayed silent, then nodded. Mark stepped closer, put a hand on my shoulder, thoughtful. Don't wear it like armor, John. Wear it like memory. Don't make it a wall. Let it remind you that you lived. You sacrificed. You did your duty. I took a deep breath, eyes fixed on my reflection in the mirror. Deep wrinkles, graying hair, but the fire still in my gaze. I pulled the jacket over my shoulders, feeling its heavy weight, not as a shield, but a reminder that I'd never disappeared. Mark gave my shoulder a light squeeze, a faint smile. Go, John. Don't let them rewrite your story. I nodded, turned back to the phone, booked a red-eye flight to Richmond. That decision wasn't for forgiveness, but to be present. So this time, they couldn't deny I existed. The landing announcement faded, and I pulled my suitcase out of the terminal. The damp Richmond air of March filling my lungs, carrying a hint of spring sweetness mixed with the lingering chill of winter. I'd left this place 6 years ago, but the road from the airport to the old neighborhood was etched in my memory. The car turned onto Jackson Avenue, lined with blooming cherry trees, pink petals falling with the breeze, blanketing the sidewalk like a welcoming carpet. But to me, the scene didn't signify return, only the distance between its fresh beauty and the estrangement in my heart. When the car stopped on the familiar street, I stepped out, my pace slowing before the neat row of houses, their white fences freshly painted, lawns trimmed as if the whole neighborhood was proving its perfection. Mrs. Langford, the neighbor across the street, was hunched over, watering her lilacs. She looked up, squinting through thick glasses, then let out a soft gasp. John? Good heavens, you're still in the service? Her voice held more surprise than welcome, and I only nodded, offering a polite smile. Still am, ma'am. She shook her head slowly, her eyes lingering on the shoulder of my uniform beneath my light coat. a mix of curiosity and something hard to name, then said softly, just loud enough for me to hear, "I thought, after everything, you'd have left it all behind." I didn't respond, just gave a slight bow, and kept pulling my suitcase toward the familiar house. That house, once my home with Elaine and Daniel, now stood eerily perfect, almost artificial. New roof tiles, freshly painted shutters, every brick on the path scrubbed clean as if time had left no mark. Not a stray branch, not a crack in the wall. A perfection so cold it chilled. I paused at the steps, the glossy wooden door gleaming like fresh varnish, the doorbell's metallic chime familiar yet distant. Inside I heard footsteps, a light tap, then the door swung open. Elaine stood there, beige slacks, pearl blouse, hair neatly pinned, every silver strand in place, her eyes scanning my uniform like an inspection. For a fleeting moment I saw a flicker at the corner of her mouth, almost like unease, but her face quickly returned to its cold composure. "John." Her voice was flat, neither high nor low, just enough to block any warmth. "Please don't ruin Daniel's day." I stood still, gripping the suitcase handle. 6 years of silence, and her first words to me weren't a greeting, not a nod to shared memories, but a warning. The sharp lemon scent of the house wafted out, a smell I remembered from long ago, when Elaine cleaned until the house felt more like a magazine photo than a place real people lived. I met her eyes, didn't answer, just gave a slight nod, because I knew in that moment any explanation would be pointless. I pulled the suitcase inside, and the moment my foot touched the spotless rug, I understood I was a stranger in the house I once called mine. The chandelier above cast a white glow, reflecting off the table set with flowers, off the family photos lining the walls, all without me. 6 years had been enough for Elaine to build a perfect family without John Mercer, and now I was back not to break that picture, but to remind them that, whether they wanted it or not, I still existed. The chandelier in the dining room blazed like artificial sunlight, reflecting off the long, polished table covered with a pristine white cloth, glassware aligned like a diplomatic reception. I stepped in, suitcase left in the living room, but no one turned to greet me. No voice rose above the soft clink of cutlery on porcelain. Elaine stood at the head of the table, her smile measured, her eyes gliding over me like I was a piece of furniture. "Sit at the end, there's a spot open," she said, her voice smooth but firm, like an order. I pulled out the chair, the wood creaking softly, sounding in my ears like a shrill screech. Before me was only a set of cutlery and a glass of water, while red wine shimmered in glasses up the table. Daniel sat near the center, surrounded by friends and relatives, the confident air of a groom-to-be, but not once did his eyes turn my way. Some distant uncle, face flushed from a few drinks, looked over and chuckled. "John's guarding some industrial park now, right? Really putting that old century experience to use." The table broke into giggles, a few nodding as if the comment confirmed my life story. I gripped the water glass, my hand cold against it. Elaine smiled, set her fork down, her voice sweet enough to carry. "We should be grateful, at least he's found work to keep himself busy." The words sounded like praise but cut like a twisting knife, prompting awkward laughs from some, while others moved on to their own conversations, ignoring my presence. I stayed silent, watching, feeling like an uninvited guest at my own family's feast, with no real place. The room's air grew heavy, every story revolving around Daniel and Emily, from picking the wedding venue to their European honeymoon plans, all unfolding as if I were a shadow in that brightly lit room. Daniel laughed with relatives, shared childhood memories, but in every tale about family, about his mother, about school days, the word father never came up. When an old friend of Daniel's quietly asked, "Your dad must be proud to see you getting married," Daniel just shrugged, gave a faint smile. "He's just a gatekeeper, nothing much to tell." The table erupted in laughter again, the sound ringing in the polished artificial air. I sat there, my heart beating slow and heavy, my silence like a thin shield. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself, knowing any word now would be twisted into an annoying noise in the perfect picture Elaine had built. I lifted my knife, cut the chicken, chewed slowly, letting their hollow laughter pass like a cold breeze. At the end of the table where the chandelier's light didn't reach, I existed like an empty chair, a faint shadow, and I knew that was the role they wanted me to play tomorrow. Daniel's wedding day. I sat at the table's end, eating quietly amid the clinking cutlery and lively stories that never touched me. But in my head, another sound rang out, the sharp screech of metal scraping stone, the urgent warning blaring through my earpiece, the acrid smell of explosives mixed with desert dust. Afghanistan, 2008. That day, the sun hung like a giant fireball overhead, scorching every grain of sand, every breath. I led my squad through an area we thought was cleared, each step calculated, but fate always lurked in the thick dust. A young soldier's shout rang out, "Sir, he stepped on a mine." I turned, saw Andrew Foster, a young lieutenant then, eyes full of fire, frozen, one foot on a metal plate protruding from the dry earth. I didn't need a reminder. One glance told me, a pressure mine. Lift the foot and it'd take a life instantly. Time seemed to freeze. The desert wind stilled. I remember every detail, from the sweat dripping slowly down Andrew's face to my heart pounding in my chest. I crawled down, hot sand burning my face, shoulders scraping jagged rocks, bones feeling like they'd break. "Don't move," I barked, voice hoarse but firm. Andrew panted, eyes wide, lips trembling. "Sir, I'm gonna die." I cut him off, signaled silence, my shaking hands digging around his foot. Each grain of sand I brushed away was a gamble between life and death. I dug deeper, saw the mine's dull steel body, rusted screws grinning mockingly. The sharp smell of explosives leaked from its cracked shell. I slid my small dagger into a narrow gap, blocking the trigger mechanism, my heart racing so fast I heard nothing but blood roaring in my ears. Then the moment came, a faint click, a fragile sound but enough to decide life or death. I held my breath, stayed motionless, then slowly removed the detonator. When the lock disengaged, I pushed the mine aside. Andrew broke down, tears streaking his dust-caked face. He nearly collapsed, but I gripped his shoulder, growling, "Stay still, it's not safe yet." It took 15 more minutes to move out of the area, and when the medevac chopper landed, Andrew was exhausted. Before they loaded him onto the stretcher, blood seeping from a gash torn by sharp rocks, he grabbed my hand, voice weak but clear. "I owe you." Those 3 words still echoed in my memory, not as a promise, but as a mark etched into the bond between 2 people, tied by the thin line of life and death. But that deed went unrecorded. In my report, I only wrote, "Unit safely withdrew, no serious casualties." I didn't want a teammate's survival to become a personal trophy, didn't want brass thinking I'd risked it all for points, and so my career stalled. They promoted those with cleaner records over someone who dove into danger. I stayed a colonel, no higher, no lower. 6 years later, Daniel looked at me, not seeing the father who crawled through burning sand to save a life, but a man who couldn't climb any rank. In his eyes, I was no different from a failure. I sat at the banquet's end, hearing the relatives' laughter, watching Daniel glow as he spoke of his future. My mind back in that desert moment where sweat, blood, and steel became one, where a life was saved by trembling hands, and a will that refused to lose another soul. In this bright, artificial room, the memory of Afghanistan clung like red dust on my skin, unwashed, and I knew the cost of that day wasn't just a stalled career but an invisible gap that made my own flesh and blood see me as a nobody. The next morning, I stood before the black iron gate of Alexandria's church, where Daniel and Emily held their wedding. The gray stone church, ancient and stately, its stained glass windows gleaming in the spring sun, trees casting shade, cherry blossoms falling lightly in the breeze. Guests streamed in, dresses in every color, laughter ringing as if joy spilled across the small square out front. I paused a moment, adjusted my uniform's collar, then stepped into the main hall. At the entrance, a large seating chart was printed elegantly on ivory paper, framed in gilded wood. I traced the names, eyes moving down from friends, relatives, colleagues of the bride and groom, each placed at round tables near the stage, where the light shone brightest. Then I saw my name, Mr. Adult, John Mercer, tucked humbly at the bottom corner, table 12, right by the emergency exit. I stood still, feeling like a stone had been placed on my chest. 6 years of silence, and now, my only place was on the fringe, out of sight, where anyone slipping out would pass me without a glance. Elaine approached from behind, her cream dress hugging her frame, pearls glinting under the light. She paused beside me, eyes flicking to the chart, then to me, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "If anyone asks, say you do logistics. Got it? No one needs to hear old stories." I looked at her, said nothing. Logistics, a smooth, clean word, a bland job that left no impression. Simple, neat, erasing the traces of blood, sand, and gunpowder. I turned, stepped inside. The church was grand, white lilies lined the aisle. A string quartet played softly. Guests settled into seats with a hum of chatter. I passed groups laughing, but their eyes slid over me like a breeze. No one stopped. No one spoke. I was a gatekeeper, lost in a party of the elite, a moving shadow in a lit room. An older man, maybe Elaine's former colleague, glanced at me and asked his wife, "Who's that?" She replied softly, just loud enough for me to hear, "Just security, don't mind him." I clenched my fist but kept my face calm. I headed straight to table 12, tucked behind a large pillar, untouched by the light, chairs set by the emergency exit. The tablecloth was slightly wrinkled, the water glass already beaded with condensation, as if everything here was prepared carelessly. I sat, took a deep breath, eyes scanning the radiant hall where Daniel shook hands with friends. Emily smiled brightly amid the crowd. My son, in a crisp tuxedo, laughed endlessly, but never once looked my way. The sense of being cast out wasn't just in the seating chart, It filled the room, in the way people laughed and fell silent as I passed, in the curt nods and Elaine's calculated silence. I sat there, water glass in hand, letting the lively sounds envelop me, but my heart was in another world. In that church, I was there in flesh and blood, but to them I was little more than an invisible shadow. The prelude music ended, a spoon tapped lightly on a glass, and the room quieted. Daniel stood, holding the mic, a confident smile spreading across a face I once knew every line of. He looked around, eyes sparkling as if he were the center of the universe. "First, I want to thank everyone for coming to share our joy today." His voice rang clear, steady, with a touch of a young groom's excitement. The guests clapped loudly, laughter mixing with the creak of chairs. He went on about Emily, their love, their family and friends, words smooth as if rehearsed dozens of times. I sat at table 12, silent in the dim shadow behind the pillar, watching his every move. Then Daniel paused, his smile turning half teasing, and he raised the mic higher. "Today we have a special guest, my father." A brief pause, heads turned in the direction he pointed, eyes filled with curiosity as if I were some strange exhibit. "He's here too," Daniel emphasized, "and I'm sure he's probably proud to see his son succeed. After all, he's just a gatekeeper for the military, but I guess that's enough to make him content." For a moment, silence blanketed the room, then erupted into roaring laughter. The laughter spread like wildfire, echoing under the church's high ceiling. Some covered their mouths, but their eyes gleamed with mockery. Others glanced at me, their looks full of pity, as if watching a clumsy act. I gripped the wine glass, its cold edge pressing into my skin. The wine trembled, droplets hitting the rim with a faint clink, like teeth chattering in the cold. I said nothing. I just looked at Daniel, the son I carried on my shoulders during holiday parades, whose hand I held to school, whose letters I waited for in college, and now he stood there, mocking me before 100 people, as if I were a meaningless stranger. Elaine sat near the stage, her face holding its perfect smile, hands neatly in her lap, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch, not from pain but from quiet satisfaction that the story was told her way. Emily, the bride, glanced my way briefly, but her eyes quickly vanished in the swelling laughter. No one spoke up for me, not a relative, not an old colleague. Not a single voice interrupted the farce. I sat there, head bowed, hand gripping the glass until my knuckles whitened. In that moment, I remembered that day in Afghanistan, crawling through hot sand to disarm a mine under a young lieutenant's foot. I remembered the smell of gunpowder, the anguished cries, Andrew's faint voice, "I owe you." Those words still rang clear, still held weight, still heavy in my heart. But here, in this glittering room, my own son, my flesh and blood, turned my life into a punchline. The laughter continued, fading into whispers, eyes glancing at me, then turning away, indifferent, as if my presence had served its assigned role, the role of the diminished, lifting others up. I raised the glass, took a sip, the bitter liquid burning down my throat like fire, but at least it kept me from trembling more. I set the glass down gently, so the clink wouldn't stand out in the room filled with that laughter, and I sat still, like a shadow, waiting for the next storm, knowing this was only the prelude to the humiliation they had planned for me on the day I should have been called by the most sacred name, Father. Her long white wedding dress brushed lightly against the floor, the chandelier's light casting a radiant but stern glow on her face, starkly different from her gentle demeanor all evening. She walked toward me with steady steps, her heels tapping softly on the tiled floor, the room gradually falling silent as if everyone was waiting to see what drama the bride would stir. Daniel looked stunned, reaching to stop her, but Emily deftly sidestepped, her eyes never leaving me. At table 12, where I sat hidden in shadow, she stopped, adjusted her dress, and bowed deeply. Her voice rang clear, unwavering, resolute. "Sir, please forgive my husband." The room froze. No more laughter, no more whispers, just a thick silence as if all the air had been sucked out. I looked at Emily, and in her eyes there was no pity, only respect. My shoulders felt heavier yet straighter. Daniel stood rigid, microphone still in hand, mouth open but speechless. Elaine paled, her lips pressed tight until they turned purple, her hand gripping her wineglass so hard the liquid spilled onto the tablecloth. A few guests turned fully, astonished. Then Emily looked up, her voice continuing, low and firm. "You may not know, but Daniel's father, Mr. John Mercer, saved a young soldier's life on the battlefield in Afghanistan in 2008. That soldier was Major Andrew Foster, my family's colleague and friend." A murmur stirred. Military names weren't unfamiliar, and Foster was one anyone who followed the news had heard. Emily scanned the room, eyes gleaming but steadfast. He crawled through burning sand, under fire, to disarm a mine under his comrade's foot. Without him, Andrew wouldn't be alive to have a family today. I know because Andrew told the story many times. He owes his life to the father you just heard called a gatekeeper. The silence shattered with the sound of chairs shifting, sharp breaths. From a table near the aisle, a silver-haired man, chest still broad, stood. He slowly raised his hand to his temple, saluting crisply in military fashion. A brief moment, then 2, 3 more. Veterans in suits, a few guests who'd served, stood repeating the gesture. The soft sound of shoes, hands raised, all directed at me. I sat motionless, but in my chest my heart pounded, both pained and proud. I'd forgotten the feeling of comrades' eyes that needed no explanation, only absolute acknowledgement. Daniel stood frozen, the microphone at his lips, sweat beading on his forehead. His words, the joke he thought would make the room laugh, now cast a dark shadow back on him. Elaine bowed her head, but I saw her neck twitch, her jaw clenched as if it might break. She knew her perfect charade had cracked. Her whole life, she'd built an image of a flawless Mercer family, a clean story without me. But in one bow from Emily, it all crumbled. I gently set my wineglass down, stood. I said nothing, only returned a slight nod, my eyes meeting each person saluting me. No words needed, no defense required. Everything was said through the bride's action, the only one in that room who dared to speak the truth. In that moment, I was no longer the invisible shadow at table 12. I was present, and everyone saw. The hum of the hall still lingered behind me, whispers mixed with chairs shifting, but I no longer cared to look back. Emily lightly touched my arm, her voice soft but firm. "Let me walk you outside for a bit." I didn't object. We moved slowly through the church's hallway, golden light falling on the cold stone floor, each step echoing like drumbeats in my chest. The wooden door closed behind us, the night air rushing in, cool and real, unlike the stifling pretense of that room. Emily still held my arm, her hands trembling from what had just happened. We stopped under the awning, where streetlights lit the falling cherry blossoms. "I'm sorry," she said, her eyes bright but teary. "I couldn't let them treat you like that anymore. I know the truth. I heard it from Andrew. He told the story so many times, how you saved his life. I've held it in since I learned Daniel was your son." I looked at that young face, her voice trembling but not weak. And for the first time in years, I saw someone truly see through me. Not through the distorted lens of family, not through fabricated stories. "You don't need to apologize," I said, voice hoarse. "Daniel says what he wants. I'm used to it." Emily shook her head, her brown hair trembling. "No, you shouldn't be used to that injustice. Daniel, he doesn't understand. He thinks you abandoned the family for your career, but he doesn't know what you sacrificed, what you carried on your shoulders. I respect you, truly." The night breeze carried the scent of damp grass, making her voice carry further, clearer. My heart twinged, not from pain, but because for the first time someone in this circle, the circle that had excluded me for 6 years, spoke the word respect. Emily looked at me, hesitated, then continued. "I know you're disappointed in Daniel, but I believe deep down he wants to be proud of you. He just doesn't know how, except by hiding admiration behind cruel jokes." I let out a dry chuckle like old paper. If that's his way of showing it, he picked the wrong weapon. Emily pursed her lips, then placed her small but steady hand on mine. "Let me apologize for him, and for this family. They may not understand, but I do. I want you to know that today, at least one person stood by you." I fell silent. Her words pierced the place I'd buried for years. The void left from my wife's funeral, the empty chairs at dinners, the calls that never came. And now that void had a small piece filled by a daughter-in-law just entering the family. I looked up at the night sky, sparse stars, then back at Emily. "Thank you," I said slowly, each word heavy as stone but light as breath. In her eyes I saw not pity, but true acknowledgement. And that, to me, was worth more than any hollow toast in that room. We hadn't stood under the awning long when rapid footsteps echoed behind. Daniel appeared, face flushed, whether from wine or anger unclear, his eyes darkening when he saw Emily still holding my hand. "Go inside," he said to his wife, voice low but each word like a hammer strike. Emily hesitated, looked at me, then let go and stepped back, leaving father and son face to face. Daniel turned, his face taut. "What did you just do? You turned my wedding into a circus." "People came to celebrate us, not to hear about your outdated war stories." I looked at him, not rushing to reply. In my eyes, the boy who sat on my shoulders watching parades was now a stranger, his voice full of scorn. Daniel stepped closer, voice sharper. "You know what? My whole life I've dealt with whispers. They said you were never home, that you cared more about the military than me. And today, when I finally had a chance to prove I rose above, you stole that spotlight. You humiliated me in front of hundreds." I clenched my fist, then relaxed, took a deep breath. My voice came low, slow, firm. "No, you humiliated yourself when you forgot who raised you. When you stood on that stage calling your father a gatekeeper, you didn't hurt me as much as you thought. You only showed everyone you forgot your roots, your father's sacrifices, your blood." Daniel sneered, his eyes flashing anger. Roots? Sacrifices? You always talk about sacrifices, about the battlefield, but did you ever think about Mom and me at home? You left us to fend for ourselves, and now you come back, demanding to be hailed as a hero? I looked up at him, heart tightening, but my reply came steady. I never demanded to be hailed. I only wanted to be seen for the truth. And the truth is, everything you have today, including the chance to stand in this church, was built on the years I bore for you. Daniel stiffened, jaw clenched, then growled. You can believe that if you want, but to me, you're just the past. A past I don't need to be tied to anymore. Those words cut like a cold blade through my chest, but I kept my gaze steady. If that's your choice, I said, then from now on, I won't hold you back. You chose to cut ties, and I'll respect that. The air between us grew thick, only the night wind whistling through the church door's cracks. Emily stood at a distance, eyes wet but silent, knowing no words could mend this now. Daniel gave me one last look, a mix of anger and fear, then turned sharply, his footsteps echoing hard on the stone. I stood still, a heavy weight on my shoulders but also a clarity. Tonight I lost a son, but tonight I reclaimed myself, no longer letting anyone define me by their contempt. The next morning I was at Reagan National Airport, suitcase in hand, planning a quiet return to Norfolk. I had no idea that last night someone in the hall had recorded Emily's bow to me and posted it online. As I passed through the revolving door, noise hit like a wave. Cameras flashing, microphones thrusting forward, questions piling in the air. Mr. Mercer, were you surprised by the bride's public salute? What do you think of your son's words? Is it true you saved an officer's life in Afghanistan? I froze, hand tightening on the suitcase strap. The flashing lights brought back desert dust and Andrew Foster's desperate eyes. A security guard stepped forward, offering another exit, but I raised a hand to stop him. I didn't want to hide. I'd been silent too long, and that silence had let others tell my story. Today, here, I knew I had to speak. I stepped toward a small podium near the information desk, where an American flag and travel brochures stood. The crowd of reporters followed, jostling. I set my suitcase down, looked straight into the cameras, took a deep breath. I know why you're here, I began, voice low but clear. You want an answer, a defense, or a story to sell? So listen closely. I wasn't disowned by my family. I was silenced. But silence is a weapon too. The room stirred, pens scratched, cameras recorded every move. I continued. For 6 years, my name wasn't spoken in my own home. At my wife's funeral, I was pushed to the back. At dinners, I was made an outsider. And yesterday, my own son mocked me before hundreds. But the truth can't be erased by laughter. It endures, and last night, one person dared to bring it to light. I paused, scanning the crowd. A young reporter raised a hand, voice shaky. Do you regret it, living a military life and losing family ties? I looked straight at him, shook my head. I don't regret serving. I regret letting silence be my only answer. But today I choose differently. I pulled a small folder from my suitcase, held it up. As of today, I'm founding the Valor Foundation, an organization to support veterans abandoned, misunderstood, or slandered by their own families. We'll provide legal aid, mental health support, and a network so they know they're not alone. Because the enemy isn't always on a distant battlefield, it's at the family table, in whispers that tarnish their honor. A wave of silence spread, then camera shutters snapped. I saw faces in the crowd soften, eyes shifting from curiosity to respect. I spoke slowly, like hammering into the air. We have plenty of groups for wounded veterans, for the disabled, but no one's thought of soldiers abandoned by their own families. I want them to know there's a place that welcomes them, calls them by their true name, recognizes their worth. A female reporter pushed forward. Mr. Mercer, are you implying your own family? I gave a dry smile. I'm not implying. I'm stating the truth. Connecting the dots is up to them. I connected mine long ago. The hall buzzed, but I didn't waver. I picked up my suitcase, looked into the cameras one last time. Silence was used to erase me from the story. Now I use my voice to rewrite it. The Valor Foundation will be the voice for those forced to stay silent. In this time, no one can make us disappear. As I turned, the noise erupted behind me, but in my heart was a rare stillness, not heavy, but shaped like a new beginning. Weeks later, I stood in a grand Pentagon room, polished wood walls, deep green carpet, a starred flag gleaming under the light, seats filled with generals, defense advisors, civilian experts, all eyes on the podium where I stood. Behind me, a large screen read, "The Valor Foundation, protecting veterans from family betrayal." I took a deep breath, hands steady on the podium's edge. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, voice low and even. We've built systems to shield soldiers from weapons, battlefields, enemies, but what about wounds from the least expected place? From the family table, from relatives mocking laughter, from deliberate silence erasing them from the story. Those are the deepest cuts. A few chairs shifted, brows furrowed. An old admiral frowned, asked bluntly, "Mr. Mercer, with all due respect, this sounds personal, not policy. Do you want the military meddling in family affairs?" I looked straight at him, voice calm. "Every policy starts personal. A wounded veteran abandoned by their own blood is no different from one left on a battlefield. We talk about morale, military honor. That honor isn't just medals. It must be upheld in every home." The room fell quiet. I switched slides. Data appeared. Charts showing veteran depression and suicide rates after family rejection. Reports filed under low priority. I tapped the podium. "We've lost too many not to bullets, but to betrayal from those they expected safety from. And this system has no tools to protect them. I propose 3 steps. Immediate legal aid for veterans whose rights are violated by family. Specialized mental health support for those rejected by kin. And a mechanism to shield careers from slander by their own." Murmurs rose. Some shook heads, but I saw a civilian expert in the corner scribbling furiously, eyes alight. A young advisor stood, asked, "But if we set this precedent, won't it turn the military into a place for personal disputes?" I replied, each word deliberate, "No, this isn't personal, it's systemic. When family becomes a tool to destroy a soldier's career, it's no longer a private tragedy, but a threat to discipline, loyalty, and force readiness." The mood shifted. A few generals nodded. The admiral stayed silent, no longer objecting. I ended with one line, letting the silence fill the room. "We train soldiers to survive battlefields. It's time to teach this institution to protect them when they come home." No one clapped. This wasn't a place for applause, but I saw exchanged glances, thoughtful nods. The meeting closed, and a deputy defense secretary approached, offering his hand. "Mr. Mercer, we'll approve it. The Valor Foundation will get initial funding and coordination rights. You've made us see a gap ignored too long." I shook his hand, feeling its firmness. In that moment, I knew I was no longer just the father, mocked at a banquet. I had become a voice for thousands of veterans, and this time, my story became a nation's policy. 3 years later, I left behind lit conference rooms and chart-filled offices. I chose Maine, a coastal village by cliffs, where the wind carried salt and waves beat like the ocean's heartbeat. My small wooden house, painted plain white, faced the sea, its wide windows open to light. I set up an easel in the corner, each morning brewing coffee and spending hours watching watercolors bleed across canvas, capturing silver blue waves and skies shifting with the seasons. The paintings weren't for sale or galleries, just my way of learning silence without pain. On my desk sat an old laptop, connected to the Valor Foundation's young team. From an idea, we grew into a national network, with offices in 8 states, a 24/7 hotline. I joined video meetings, reviewed cases, signed support proposals, and each time a veteran smiled again, I felt a piece of myself heal. Daniel never reached out. His wedding marked a final divide, followed by absolute silence. But Emily, the girl who bowed to me that day, sent handwritten letters regularly. Cream envelopes, careful script, telling of her work, of grandchildren I'd never held. Each letter brought a lump to my throat, warm yet distant. I didn't blame her. I learned to cherish those honest words. Proof that in the Mercer family there was once someone who didn't deny the truth. On summer evenings I sat on the porch, flipping through my half-written memoir. It held not just battlefields and bloodshed, but the silences at my wife's funeral, the dinners where I was pushed to the end, the long nights waiting for a call that never came. I wrote it all, not for pity, but so someone later might read and understand that silence can kill and presence can save. The sea breeze tousled my now white hair, salt weaving into my shirt. I stood, walked to the cliff's edge, watched the sun set red over the horizon, my heart lighter as if I'd finally shed the weight on my shoulders. I thought of fallen comrades, veterans who came to the foundation in despair, of Emily and her patient letters. And I understood. Justice, for me, wasn't an apology from Daniel or a regretful look from Elaine, but the right to tell my story without it being erased. I returned to the porch, picked up my pen, and wrote the final line of my memoir. Honor doesn't need to be bestowed. It comes from daring to be present, even when the world wants you to vanish. The story of John Mercer, a former colonel who saved a comrade's life in Afghanistan, yet was mocked by his own son at his wedding, reflects a painful reality in American society today. Many veterans return not only to face war's psychological scars, but also indifference, sometimes denial from their own families. When Daniel stood before hundreds and called his father a gatekeeper, it wasn't just a cruel joke, but a symbol of disrespect for the sacrifices of the generation before. In stark contrast, Emily, the daughter-in-law, bowed to John and revealed the truth. He saved Andrew Foster's life. Her action reminds us that society still has those who dare to defend the truth, who grant recognition to those who deserve it, even if it shatters a false silence. The lesson lies not just with the Mercers, but mirrors the reality of millions of American families. Silence can erase a person, while acknowledgement, even from one, can restore a lifetime's honor. John's founding of the Valor Foundation shows another path, turning personal pain into communal strength, creating a support network so no veteran abandoned by family feels alone. In a society that glorifies individual success and polished images, this story reminds us that respect and gratitude must begin at home. Every American can learn from John and Emily. Dare to face the truth. Don't let silence or mockery define a person's worth, for honor isn't a gift bestowed, it's what we uphold through presence and courage. If John Mercer's story has made you reflect on the value of honor and presence, please subscribe to join us in exploring more stories that touch the heart. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video with journeys full of resilience and truths that cannot be silenced.